Hi, everybody. I just took a look at the participants, and it is so great to see so many of your names. It's odd that we've gotten to a point where just seeing your names makes me happy. Don't even need to see you. Anyway, we are so happy that you're with us tonight. We're very excited about this new program that we're offering. The word that I would use to describe what I expect from this evening is delightful. The film, delightful, right? Hadn't seen it in, I think, since I was a teenager. And of course, Ivor Davis is a delight. I'll introduce him in a moment. First, I want to let you know we would love to hear, as you think of them while Ivor is talking, we'd love to hear all of your questions, all of your comments. You are all on mute and we can't see you, which, by the way, means you can go change into your pajamas, get another glass of wine, whatever you want. Nobody will know. But please use the chat function or the Q&A, preferably the Q&A. Denise Sindelar, the museum's deputy director, will be keeping track of that all night, and she will take all of your questions at the end after we have heard from Ivor. So Ivor needs no introduction, but I just adore him. He is one of Ventura's living treasures. Doing this in and of itself is historic, and I am so thankful to him for letting the museum peek into his brain and be the happy conduit to share so many of his memories. So sit back, enjoy, and thank you for being here.
Good evening. Well, thank you for that. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, because I have to leave for 10 minutes because you described me as a living treasure, and I think there's all sorts of dust all over me. So I'm going to clean up and come back in 10 minutes. Just kidding. Well, good evening and welcome to A Hard Day's Night. We're going to have some fun tonight because I want to hold your attention. Okay, I'll keep my day job on that. And I promise not to make our conversation too much of a long and winding road. Okay. Enough of this silliness, just let it be, for goodness sake. Now, before we refresh your memories with the trailer of this groundbreaking movie, I would like to explain what my credentials are that entitle me to be sitting up here in front of my computer, rambling on about the most famous group in rock and roll history. So, please settle back for a few minutes with a nice glass of wine or something like that, and watch as I am grilled mercilessly by all I can describe him as an ace investigative reporter, who, as you will see, savagely interrogates me about the Fab Four from Liverpool. We were very lucky to be able to retrieve this hard-hitting interview from the bowels of the British Museum. So, Jonathan, would you please show the first tape? I'd like to refresh your memories about the movie we're going to talk about tonight. And so, again, if I could ask Jonathan if he would show us the trailer of this groundbreaking, wonderful movie that goes down in history as one of the best films of its genre. So if you mind hitting it, Jonathan, let's watch the trailer, please. And let me tell you this, that I will never forget the first time I saw A Hard Day's Night. And let me tell you why. And then you'll understand why I will never forget when I first saw the movie. It was 56 years ago this month, August the 31st, 1964. It was the night before the Beatles had just finished a concert at the Atlantic City Convention Hall in front of 19,000 screaming fans. They had a day off, and the promoter, who also owned the Lafayette Motel, where we were all staying, decided to have a private screening to show the Beatles' new movie. So we gathered in a large conference room at the top of the hotel and helped ourselves to a lavish seafood buffet. Just before the lights went down, the door opened and in walked the promoter, a man named George Hamid, a lively character who once ran his own circus. He was now a multi-millionaire and the owner of the Atlantic City's famous tourist attraction, the Steel Pier. And right behind Mr. Hamid was about half a dozen beautiful young women in various provocative stages of undress. And before our very eyes, Mr. Hamid turned to the Beatles and said loudly, "Take your pick." Well, of course, I jumped up, but quickly realized the invitation did not extend to me. And then I watched as each of the disbelieving Beatles took the hand of the maiden of their choice and slowly walked out of the room. I swear this happened. And I assumed, of course, that the Beatles were about to be taken on a walking tour of the Atlantic City boardwalk, or even visit the pier, or maybe not. Now, when the 2-hour film ended and the lights came on again, the Beatles were all sitting in the back row next to the fair maidens of their choice. Why didn't you stay and watch? I asked Paul, and he said, yeah, it was great fun, wasn't it? But I saw the film last month. And John said he too had seen the film 2 or 3 times, and he wondered if it showed whether he was nervous. And he said, the director, Richard Lester, said to me, "I know you can't act, but be yourselves in the film." And we did. Now, let me tell you a bit about the film. Believe it or not, the movie was shot mainly to release the Beatles songs like Hard Day's Night, Can't Buy Me Love, I'm Happy to Just Dance With You. And the movie was actually second banana to the songs. In fact, if you really want to know, it was an early music video shot in 16 weeks, starting in March 1964 for under $500,000 by the talented American director, Richard Lester. And it was shot shortly before the Beatles embarked on their incredible 5-week American tour, the tour that I wrote about in my book, The Beatles and Me on Tour. And I can tell you from my personal observations on the American tour, a lot of what you saw in this movie actually happened on the tour. By the way, here's a funny story about the film. Now, United Artists were very, very worried that no one would come and see the film because they wouldn't understand the Liverpool accents. Well, maybe they were right, maybe they were wrong, because I remember seeing in that era films about Northern Ireland and about Scotland, and believe it or not, they did have subtitles. No way subtitles, said the Beatles. And then somebody then suggested that they redub all the Beatles' voices, giving them mid-Atlantic American accents. Well, no way, said Paul McCartney. He said, I remember, he said, "I've had to suffer through dozens of Texas cowboy accents in all the movies I've seen. You must keep our voices." Now, by the way, and unfortunately I'm not with you, but I can't see you waving, but which Beatle do you think emerged as the biggest star in the film, the most likable, once the movie was shown? Think about it. Ringo, yes. Now, as I said, the movie really does depict the insanity of the Beatle life. I remember at a party when the Beatles first came to America in February 1964 to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show, a lady at the reception at the home of the British ambassador in Washington, D.C., crept up behind Ringo and actually tried to clip a lock of Ringo's hair. He took it very well. And by the way, that Ed Sullivan Show was historic because 74 million people tuned in to Ed Sullivan. Can you believe it? 74 million. But the sense of humor you see in the movie at the press conferences was exactly right. Remember the line the reporter said to, I think it was John, "How did you find America?" And John said, "Right, turn left at Greenland." And somebody else asked Ringo, "Are you a mod or a rocker?" And Ringo shot back in a flash, "I'm a mocker." I went to 30 press conferences because they had them in every city they arrived in. And the Beatles were very funny. They were able to finish each other's lines. And you know, the other thing that's interesting is you may not have noticed, but in the railway carriage in the movie, the young girl was Pattie Boyd. And Pattie, of course, who was a model, and she went on to marry George Harrison, who she met on the film. And then, of course, she divorced George Harrison for his best buddy, Eric Clapton. And all those jokes in the movie about Paul McCartney's grandfather, played by the Irish actor Wilfrid Bramble, who was constantly referred to as, "He's a clean old man." It was an inside joke because Bramble played a dirty old man in the popular British television series sitcom called Steptoe and Son. But the Beatles had fun on the film, but they never realized that they were tied up to a 3-picture deal with United Artists Studios. In fact, Brian Epstein, their manager, who did a terrific job with them, didn't tell them about the movie commitment. So they made a second film, which was called Help, which was shot in the Bahamas, and they didn't enjoy making it as much. And Ringo, again, turned out to be the star of that one. But of course, the film didn't receive the accolades as did A Hard Day's Night. Okay, so here we are. The thing I wanted to tell you was that they cleverly avoided making a third movie, and I'll tell you how. They did fulfill their contractual obligations, and let me tell you how. Their third film was Yellow Submarine, which was, as you know, an animated movie. And of course, if you remember this, at the very end of the movie, the Beatles showed up in person. I mean, it had nothing to do with the film, but by cleverly doing that, it meant that they had fulfilled their obligations and made their third film. And even their voices in the Yellow Submarine were dubbed. Okay, so now I would like to change direction a bit, because tonight just happens to be the 55th anniversary of a very special occasion in rock and roll history. And it was the night the Beatles went to visit Elvis Presley in his kingdom, in his house in Beverly Hills. And I was lucky enough to join them, the only newspaper reporter there. So here's a bit of the background. In 1964, the Beatles were keen to meet Elvis. I mean, John grew up with Elvis, Heartbreak Hotel, Blue Suede Shoes, all those songs. And Elvis was the king to them. But in 1964, the Beatles were too busy on their tour, and Elvis was busy making crappy cookie cutter movies. When I say cookie cutter, Elvis himself said, well, in the movie, I get the girl, a different leading lady, I beat up the bad guy, I sing 10 crappy songs, and that's it. And so Elvis was too busy. But then in 1965, I got the call from Brian Epstein's office, come along, we're going to see Elvis. The Beatles were in awe. On the way, the Beatles had a few cups of tea, which kind of loosely says a few puffs of mind-enhancing cigarettes. And finally, when they arrived at Elvis's house, believe it or not, there were about 100 girls screaming. Now, why we were surprised that there were 100 girls screaming was because Brian Epstein wrote a letter, and I saw the letter saying, this is not to become a media circus. No photographs, no tape recorders, no reporters. Yet when we got there, there were a lot of young women. And John kind of marched into the room, into the house, and said, we've come to see the owner. He was being funny. But when we got in there, and I kind of disappeared into the wallpaper, I watched as the Beatles sat down, and just about 10 yards away on a white couch, there was a guy in a tight suit, and I remember he had sideburns like shag carpeting. And believe it or not, that was Elvis. And he was fiddling with a remote control for a television that had no sound. Now, the amazing thing is that after 10 minutes, nobody introduced the Beatles to Elvis. It was ridiculous. Don't ask me why. The Beatles didn't want to take over. Elvis, if he'd had any sense, would have stood up and greeted his guests, but he didn't. After 10 minutes, he said, I'm going to bed. And then the Beatles said, and then he said very cleverly, unless you guys want to jam, and they jammed. They brought out the guitars, they started playing music, no Beatle music, just Elvis music, Sam Cooke music, other songs of other black entertainers, roll over Beethoven and stuff like that. And that broke the ice. It broke the ice so that the Beatles started talking to Elvis. And as I listened, I heard them talking about the fear of flying. I heard them talk about the fact that the road was a hard road to travel. And then Paul said something which I think irritated Elvis. He meant to say it nicely, but he said, Elvis, I wish you made music and songs like you used to. Well, to Elvis, that felt like it was an insult, and he got very upset. But you've got to realize this, and I didn't realize it until I left the house. Elvis was king of the castle, king of rock and roll. All of a sudden, these upstarts from Liverpool come to his country, and they knock him off the perch. Not only that, Elvis makes these 3 movies a year, and nobody's crazy about the 3 movies a year. The Beatles make 1 movie, A Hard Day's Night, and it's a smash hit. Well, I want to tell you, the conversation went on a bit like that. They were fairly comfortable with each other, and then along into the room comes a young lady. She looks about 17 to me. I think she was all of 19. She is 5 foot tall with a 4 foot tall bouffant hairstyle. So she was 9 feet tall, actually, if you really want to add it up. And that was Priscilla. And for the first time, Elvis warmed up and introduced the Beatles to Priscilla. And Priscilla, didn't have much to say for herself. The conversation also covered an interesting thing that I suddenly remembered not long ago, because I never wrote about it. The Beatles managed to fuse with Elvis over a film they had both seen the year before. The film was Dr. Strangelove and How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, which is a beautiful parody of a movie by the great film director Stanley Kubrick. And the reason why they merged on that one was because Elvis had a good sense of humor and he loved the film. The Beatles were mad about Peter Sellers, who plays 3 roles in that movie. And not only that, John was a great fan of Peter Sellers, the British comedian actor, because he was in a show called The Goon Show. And The Goon Show was a successful radio show. So for the first time, they kind of got along even better than at the beginning. And I thought about this many times. Somebody should have been the diplomat to do the introductions, but nobody did. And I told you what happened. So they said they would meet each other again, but of course they never did. They never met Elvis again, even though they would have liked to probably. But then I discovered a few years later that the Beatles were very upset at Elvis, because here's what he did. In pursuit of President Richard Nixon, he wrote Richard Nixon a letter, which I saw. It's in the Smithsonian or somewhere, in which he said, Mr. Nixon, I'd like to come and meet you. I think I can bring votes to you, a younger generation, they follow me, etc., etc. And so he went to Washington and he went to see Richard Nixon. And there's some pictures of him seeing Richard Nixon. And he, believe it or not, took a gift for Richard Nixon, and it was a revolver. Can you believe walking into the White House today with a revolver in your belt? No. And he wanted something from Richard Nixon. He wanted a federal agent badge, and he got it. And why he wanted the badge, I don't know. Maybe if he got arrested and he was had drugs on him, he would have flashed his badge and said, "Let me go." Terrible impersonation of Elvis, I know. So he got his badge, and unfortunately, as the world knows, he ended up using too many drugs that killed him this month again at the age of 42. Terrible. But the other thing that I would like to add to the Beatles and Elvis was that the Beatles were upset because Elvis said to Richard Nixon, and it's on the record, those Beatles, they came to America, they made millions of dollars, they went back to England, and they bad-mouthed America. Well, that was not true. When Ringo heard that, he was upset. He said, I don't want to meet this guy anymore. And all the Beatles were upset because for whatever reason, Elvis said that. Maybe he was under the influence of drugs or who knows what. But that was a raw deal. But again, I think when you analyze it, Elvis was upset. He'd been in the army. His career was sagging a bit. He was sagging a bit. And so he decided to take it, hit the Beatles with it. Now, the other thing I would like to add before I show you, Jonathan will show you a film, was after the Beatles met Elvis, a day or so later, they were kind of lukewarm. They were, yeah, well, it was fun. We rapped with him. We got on with him very well, but it wasn't a roaring success. Believe me, I was there. I saw it. I would not call it a roaring success. And yet, 10, 15 years later, when the Beatles did their anthology, which was a great review of their lives, they talked about meeting Elvis. And strangely enough, as you will hear in a moment, all of a sudden it was sunshine and roses. Wow, what an event. It was an event. It was an incredible event. I wish we had pictures. But now I'd like Jonathan, if you don't mind, to, if you would, play the tape of the Beatles talking about their visit to Elvis. Well, thank you, Jonathan. It's interesting to listen to that because there's a slightly different slide on it. I'm not sure Ringo quite had it right. He said he was big with the CIA. I'm not too sure that Elvis was ever big with the CIA, but it's fascinating to see their evaluation. They're kind of mixed. They're happy, and yet they realize it was history. One of the things that a lot of people, and I know we were supposed to be talking about the film, and I hope that some of you will have some questions about the film, but I wanted to, because the fascinating thing was, why did Elvis self-destruct at such a young age, at 42? Why did he die of a drug overdose in Graceland? And the Beatles, of course, I mean, you know the history of the Beatles, but I think the difference was that Elvis just had Elvis. He had his sycophantish, as George mentioned it, Memphis Mafia, who did his every bidding. But the Beatles had each other, even though they broke up in 1967, I think it was. They had each other, and they all wanted to go and make their own careers. And the interesting thing between Elvis and the Beatles was this. I went to see Elvis a couple of times in Las Vegas, where he performed, first of all, at the International Hotel and then at the Hilton Hotel. And when I first saw him, he was terrific. But then in the last year or so of his life, he was not terrific. He was overweight. He forgot the lines of his songs sometimes. And an interesting thing I found out, and this is going to amaze you, I think. Elvis was signed again, besides the movie career. He made 30 odd movies, don't forget, 30 odd movies. After the movie career, he was also signed, as I say, to Las Vegas, and he helped resuscitate Las Vegas. People went to see him, no doubt. But Colonel Tom Parker, who was his manager, who was a fairground guy, Colonel Tom Parker had him working crazily. And I'm going to tell you this, and you're probably not going to believe me, but check it out. So how many performances over 5 or 6 years do you think that Elvis made in Las Vegas? Okay, unfortunately, under this situation, you can't shout out your answers, but here's the answer. Elvis performed in Vegas 837 times. I mean, that is crazy. I know, it's just ridiculous. And why did Elvis, and I know we're talking about the Beatles, but it kind of overlaps. Elvis played Vegas because Colonel Parker liked Vegas. Colonel Parker was given the suite of offices. He was given the run of Las Vegas, the run of the hotel, the run of the gambling casino. And when Colonel Parker lost a lot of money in the Hilton Hotel Casino, they kind of forgave many of his gambling debts. And the other thing, again, I know we're talking about the Beatles, but it overlaps to Elvis, I think, was why didn't Elvis ever perform like the Beatles did around the world? Why didn't they perform any concerts? Elvis could have sold out in Japan, in England, in Europe, in Australia. He never got an overseas gig because Colonel Parker was apparently an illegal immigrant. And Colonel Parker was fearful that if he went overseas with Elvis and came back with Elvis, they would discover, and it would be a terrible embarrassment. So as a result, Elvis never went overseas. Of course, he went overseas in, I forget the year, but he went overseas when he had to do military service in the army in Germany. And of course, he met his wife, his young wife in Germany, and that's how she came back to hang out in Graceland, the mansion. Now, I've kind of rambled on a little bit, but I hope some of what I've said has been interesting to you. And I think, Denise, if you can hear me, are there any questions at all, please?
I have 2 questions, Ivor, coming in from Alan Shapiro. The first question is, Ivor, when you got to Los Angeles, you were a serious reporter. I can only assume you were less than thrilled to be assigned to a relatively unknown rock band and one you knew very little about. Were there any particular early incidents that changed your mind as you got to know them?
Yeah, I'm awfully sorry, Denise, but you were a little bit muffled, and I only got half of the question. Could you repeat it again for me, please?
Happy to.
Yeah.
So the question was that as a serious reporter, you were assuming that you were less than thrilled to be assigned to a relatively unknown rock band, one you knew very little about. Were there any particular early incidents that changed your mind as you got to know them?
Well, first of all, I should say that as soon as I joined the Beatles, and I didn't know that much about them because, as I think I mentioned, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the internet, and as a result, news didn't travel as fast as it does today. I mean, if somebody sneezes in Yokohama, Japan, and somebody says, bless you, in Ventura, California, 10 seconds later. That's the way it is. So when I joined the Beatles, I didn't know much about them. I quickly learned about them. I quickly saw that they were a sensation everywhere, sellout crowds, screaming girls, and it was kind of a fun trip. And so I enjoyed it. But as a reporter, I covered everything because people say to me, well, when you got back from the Beatle trip in 1964, did you sit down and say, wow, that was an incredible journey? And I said, I did not. And the reason I did not was that the next day, the day after I returned from the Beatles traveling across North America, the office called me up and said, the Warren Commission report is out. We want you to do a story, give it to us in 2 hours. So, boom, I was back in the deep end. It wasn't until years later that I realized that I'd been on as I say, a terrific ticket to ride. It was historical. And when you are a journalist covering stories, unfortunately, you don't have the ability, or I didn't, to sit back after every big story and say, wow, that was a big story. You go on to the next assignment. You quickly focus on the next story. And it wasn't until I reached my ancient age that I'm part of the elderly crowd. If those of you know that you be very careful in coronavirus, if you're in the elderly stage, and I looked up the word elderly and I realized that it applied to me. When you are young, you just go with the wind. You just race to story. And I went to some incredible stories. Besides the Beatles, there were many other stories, political. I remember covering Ronald Reagan, who was a B-movie actor. And whoever thought that an actor or somebody in showbiz, no less, in showbiz could become president? It's ridiculous, isn't it? Sorry. Anyway, so that's sort of the answer to your question, but not really. And I apologize if it's not as complete as you wanted, but thank you for the question.
Here's a second question, Ivor. During 1964 and 1965, it's well known that the Beatles wanted to meet with Elvis and Bob Dylan. Were there any icons that they wanted to meet with but never got a chance to?
Well, you're right. And the questioner is absolutely right. Of course, they met Elvis, and you've just heard about it. And they also met Bob Dylan, and I haven't told you the story of that, but it was really a wild one because Dylan introduced them to a high grade of marijuana. And I'll never forget that he did it on the last day of their tour in 1964. And the Beatles did not know marijuana. And the funniest thing was that Dylan gave Ringo a fat cigarette. And Ringo started puffing it. And Ringo puffed and puffed and puffed. Ringo did not know it was diplomacy to have 3 puffs and pass it on. So by the time Ringo finished his first devastating marijuana cigarette, he was on the floor giggling. So I've almost lost, because I've gone around the street. Can you bring me back on the path to the question that you asked again, Denise, unless I've answered it?
No, yes. The question was, do you know of any other icons that the Beatles wanted to meet when they were in America?
I'm sorry. Yes, I mean, they met Dylan, they met Joan Baez. She wasn't that famous at the time. She was Bob Dylan's girlfriend. And they didn't want to meet. What they wanted to do was they wanted to avoid meeting people that wanted to capitalize on them. And for example, there was Jane Mansfield, who was a wannabe Marilyn Monroe, and she desperately wanted to meet the Beatles. She came and knocking at their door. She lived in the neighborhood. She knocked at their door and said, hey, you guys, do you want to hang out? Well, they didn't want to hang out, although John rather liked the look of Jane Mansfield for obvious reasons. And about 2 days later, Jane called them up and said, hey, Johnny Rivers is playing at the Whiskey A Go-Go. I know him. Why don't you come along with me? And so Paul was out, what shall I say, hobnobbing with a beautiful actress. And so the other 3 Beatles went along to the Whiskey A Go-Go. I went along with them. And that turned into a disaster because they got drunk. George Harrison kept telling the photographer not to take his picture. And Jane Mansfield was sitting in his booth with them as we watched. It was like a comedy show. And then George threw the drink at the photographer and missed the photographer and splashed another voluptuous young lady called Mamie Van Doren. She screamed, everybody screamed, and the Beatles jumped up. Jane Mansfield jumped up and they were out the back door. But I want to tell you, Burt Lancaster, they wanted to meet. They wanted to meet a handful of people. They weren't even crazy about meeting Liberace in Las Vegas. They met Shirley Temple, who wanted to meet them in San Francisco. But they were very careful, and Brian Epstein, their manager, was very careful to make sure that certain celebrities did not use the Beatles to their own benefit. And one other story, the same year, 1964, for a very worthwhile charity, the Beatles, and I'd never seen this before, went along to a garden party put on by the boss of Capitol Records. And for 2 hours, they sat around on high chairs, meeting Dean Martin's children, all the celebrities' children, because it was a fundraiser. And I want to tell you, the Beatles were absolutely charming. And this is kind of boring, and they didn't know most of the people. There was a woman, an actress named Zsa Zsa Gabor, who I heard say in her wonderful Hungarian accent, or maybe I shouldn't try a Hungarian accent because I'm not very good at accents. Do the boys sing or play the piano or something like that? So she didn't know who they were, but she brought a child of a movie star. And the secret of the meeting was that every movie star that showed up, Dean Martin family and all people like that, had to bring a child to meet the Beatles. So the answer to your question, and it's long-winded, I know, is that the Beatles like meeting celebrities and singers who they wanted to meet, and they tried their best to avoid those who were trying to use the Beatles.
Okay, here's our next question, Ivor. This is from Debbie Blount. She says, so wonderful to see you live. Were you on the set during the filming of Hard Day's Night? And can you tell the jelly bean story?
Debbie, nice of you to tune in. Debbie is a Beatle aficionado. She knows every John Lennon impersonator on the face of the earth. And she's probably managed their careers as well. So there's a lot of John Lennon impersonators there. I don't think I can actually answer your question, Debbie. And you know, I'm sorry, I can't give you a total answer to that. But all I can tell you is that Debbie knows her Beatles, and she's a Beatles fan, and she's actually a grandmother, and I'm sure there's a lot of grandmothers who are Beatle fans, but Debbie is an ageless grandmother. Sorry to reveal that, Debbie, but I'm sure you'll forgive me. Thanks.
Okay, here's the next question, Ivor. This is from Brian Vincic. Since you were assigned as a ghostwriter for George Harrison, what was your most favorite story you wrote about or with him?
About George Harrison? Thank you, Brian. Nice to hear from you. I met Brian at a Beatle fan fest several years ago, and Brian is a Beatle fan. Brian is a close friend and a benefactor for George Harrison's sister Louise, who's still around, and it was Brian, I must tell you, that took me to see Paul McCartney last year. So thank you for showing up, Brian. And I've rambled on. I've forgotten the question again. Tell it to me again. Sorry.
That's all right, Ivor. So because you were assigned as a ghostwriter for George, what was your most favorite story that you wrote about or with him?
Well, let me tell you about that. Now, George Harrison, at that tender age of in his early 20s, was not the most communicative of the Beatles. He got much better as he aged. So I had to write his column, and it was terrible because not only did George not have much to say, but he was in bed until 2:30, 3 in the afternoon because they all went to bed at 3. So 2:30, 3 in the afternoon was a disaster for me because I had to write a column under George's name. I had to be his ghostwriter. So if people keep this secret, what I did for the first few weeks was I made up the column. Sorry. I know it's going to shock you. But I did. And then George came to me about 10 days into the tour and said, Ivor, the column you've written under my name is rubbish. He actually used a stronger, more expletive description of my column for him. So I said, George, do me a favor, wake up earlier or tell me what's going on in your mind and the column will improve. And then the column did improve because he started talking to me and he was much happier. But it was a disastrous start with George. And years later, when I saw him, when he came over to on his own for his new album, we got on very well. And he remembered rather fondly my terrible columns written under his name.
Okay, here's the next question. Rebecca Fox is thrilled to listen to your talk and hearing your voice, and she wants to know, did you stay in touch with any of the Beatles over the years?
Well, the answer to the question is yes and no. If I'm not bosom buddies with them, but after the concert tour, I kept in touch with them in 65 and 66 when they finished touring the world, and they never appeared again in public after appearing at Candlestick Park in 1966. And I went to see John when he was living in LA with May Pang. He was living in a rock producer Lou Adler's house. I met him and we had a long chat. I saw Paul when he was married to Linda, and Linda and he were in the Beverly Hills Hotel, and Paul had come to Hollywood because he'd been nominated for a Best Song Oscar for the song to the movie Live and Let Die. He didn't win, of course, that year. So we sort of reunited. George I saw with Derek Taylor whenever he came over. Derek Taylor was the great press officer of the Beatles. And Derek brought George over, and I saw George when he was doing his own, I'm a star in my own right. I can be a star without being a Beatle. That was his philosophy. And then I think I might have mentioned, maybe I didn't mention, that fortunately, thanks to the good graces of my friend Brian in San Diego County, I went to see Paul and went backstage to see Paul. And the funny thing was, I must tell you this because it's an amusing story. I said to Paul, you know, we haven't talked about your first tour, but back in those days, you had 2 road managers managing the whole operation. I said, how many road managers do you have now? How many people help you tour? And he said, probably about 95. Wow, bit of a difference. And then I said, but in the old days, Paul, you used to travel around England in a beat up old station wagon with no back seat. How do you get around the world when you do a tour overseas? And he said, well, we usually travel on a jumbo jet, our own jumbo jet. And the other thing that's funny, of course, about Paul and the conversation was that I said, when you sang in 1964, you and the Beatles performed for less than 30 minutes, believe it or not. You couldn't get away with that today. And Paul said, well, I said, how long do you perform? This was before the show. How long are you going to perform tonight? He said, you wait and see. And I did wait and see. And I saw the concert and it lasted 3 hours and 15 minutes. And Paul never left the stage. And I've been to see Ringo, and I must say, Ringo is terrific. He's very clever. Ringo never had the greatest voice on the face of the earth. And even John Lennon said he wasn't the best drummer in the face of the earth, but that was a joke. He was a great drummer. He is a great drummer. I went to see Ringo, and he's very clever with his all-star band. If you go and see a show, you will see 100% of the show and maybe 65% of Ringo, because he is clever enough to leave the stage and let the young musicians that are in his all-star band do their thing. So he has a great successful career, and so does Paul, traveling around the world. It's a long-winded answer, but I see them. They don't call me for a loan because I don't think they need any money.
Okay, a couple more questions. Ivor, Lois Bach and Greg Goad, I want you to know that they have been enjoying your Manson series on epics. We've seen the film that we've never seen before. It's a wonderful series. Any story you can share with us about putting that program together?
Well, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. Indeed, I must tell you, another time, I mean, I was involved with the Manson case from day one, and I've actually written a book, a recent book called Manson Exposed, The Reporter's 50-Year Journey into Madness and Murder. So the interesting thing about the Manson case is there is a Beatle connection, because supposedly Manson used the Beatles' White Album to brainwash his band of killers, using the Beatles' lyrics like Helter Skelter and Revolution, and Manson made his believers believe that the Beatles were sending him secret messages. And of course that was ridiculous, and the Beatles thought it was ridiculous. But I must tell you that I sort of went off course, but I'm going to get back on course. The series on epics is the best I've ever seen, and I'm not saying that because I'm in it. I'm saying it because it's the most detailed. It captures the mood, the atmosphere of the time, and there's been a lot of stuff on Manson, but the Epics series is great, and it's still going on right now on the Epics channel. And I've actually gone out with a cudgel and persuaded many friends to sign on for Epics and watch the series. But the series is good, and if you've seen it, you know it's good, and if you haven't seen it, then it's worth a look. Thank you.
Okay, couple more questions because we're coming up on 7:30. Louise is asking, you have lectured for the Osher Ollie Cal State classes. Will you be doing more of them? And if so, what would you like to cover?
Well, thank you for that question, Louise. Very kind of you. The problem is that the OSHA, I had hoped to do OSHA stuff, but I am a techno idiot. And the idea of doing a program for Ollie or OSHA, which is a terrific program, I've done eyewitness to history lectures to the OSHA crowd. The problem is, quite frankly, that it's a difficult thing to pull together. This museum event is wonderful, but it's wonderful because we've got a terrific crew. I mean, Jonathan is there putting on the videos. Eric is there. Elena is there giving support. When you do an OSHA Ollie program, you're on your own basically. So the answer to the question is, I'd love to do more but I need to go back to school to learn how to master handle the Zoom connection.
Well, you might have a team who can help you out there, Ivor. Here's another question.
Thank you.
Tell us about the Beatles bus that Brian brought to Ventura.
The Beatle bus. Did you say the Beatle bus?
Yes, the Beatle bus.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, what happened was, thanks to the good graces of Brian Vinchick, who is a brilliant man who loves music, loves the Beatles, he was connected. It's all about great connections and people you know. And I said to Brian, we would love to bring the John Lennon bus to Ventura. I'd love to bring it to show the bus to young musicians who were part of the New West Symphony Harmony Project. And they're young kids from undernourished or underprivileged homes, and they're learning to play music instruments. And so, abracadabra, it happened. The bus was brought to Ventura. The bus is a brilliant recording studio. And what happened was these young musicians from Ventura came to the bus and met a brilliant guitarist called Lawrence Juba, who used to play with Wings and Paul McCartney. And Lawrence Juba was the choreographer, the director, and he had these young musicians from Ventura County making a video, a brilliant video. And it was all, thank heavens, to the fact that the bus came to Ventura was enjoyed by many kids and students. And I'm sure that if we brought the John Lennon bus back again, it would be another smash hit. So that was a way to give to the community. Believe me, it was a wonderful thing. And the Harmony Kids made a commercial, a professional commercial, and they were thrilled to bits. I can't tell you. They were joyful at doing it.
Okay, well, that looks like we're wrapping up our questions, but I wanted you to have a moment to give them a preview of what you're going to be talking about in September, on September 24th, when you are talking about Bobby.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. Well, Bobby is a very interesting picture, but I was more intrigued by it because, as some of the people that may know me, it's about the night Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. It's a theatrical film. It's not a documentary. It has a lot of great stars in it, like Anthony Hopkins, who plays a kind of a guy who works at the ambassador. And what I like about the film is that it kind of recaptures, I think Emilio Estevez directed it, who is the son of the son of Martin Sheen and the brother of Charlie Sheen. Emilio Estevez directed it and did a terrific job. It has a great, great cast. And you will be able to see that movie, which is a fascinating movie. And then I hope I will be able to add extra dimension to the film, because unfortunately I was at the Ambassador Hotel the night Bobby was killed, and I sort of walked into the kitchen at the time he was shot, and it was a memory that one never forgets. So if you see the film, then you can hear about it from somebody who was there. And then I think the following month, if I may just add, we have a much more fun film. And the fun film is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or the Sundance Kid, however you pronounce that. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with Paul Newman. And I must tell you a quick story, if I have time. I went on location on that film. And on location in the film in Cuernavaca, Mexico, the publicist on the film said to me, "Ivor, do me a favor. You've come down to interview Paul Newman, but his co-star, who's not very well known, is not getting any attention. Could you do me a big favor and interview his co-star?" And he said, "You don't even have to put any tape in the tape recorder, but he's being neglected." I said, "Sure." I put tape in the tape recorder, and I sat down with this guy, good-looking guy, very amiable, charming, and got a great interview. And of course, the name of that actor was Robert Redford. So we have some fun stories. I won't say fun stories on the Bobby Kennedy assassination, but fun stories with Paul Newman and Robert Redford in Mexico. So I hope to see you all, or I hope all of you to see me all on the next time I get a chance to do a wonderful gathering of a Museum of Ventura County members. And thank you, Denise, and thank you, Elena, and thank you, Jonathan, Eric, and everybody else who's, I know, has made this so much fun. Thank you.